So I wasn't planning on doing a little cold open here and speaking before the intro music, but we had such a great time talking to Laura, who's our guest today.
So good.
Just wanted to say you're in for a treat, really.
I mean, we spent the whole time listening, talking, and trying to scribble notes at the same time.
Yeah.
So have a notebook or whatever note-taking device that you prefer, but also just don't forget that you can just repeat the episode over and over again.
Yeah, it would definitely boost our stats.
Yeah. Listen on multiple devices and share it out. That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
You don't have to have the volume up.
No. But also we will be putting in the episode notes, the resources, and probably even a couple of key points that Laura mentions, because, I mean, it was all amazing, but we'll try and
definitely
highlight it.
And I think it's one of those episodes that isn't quite as much of a step-by-step practical how-to guide, but it's super thought-provoking. And I think that you will take away from it, different perspectives on
Definitely
your church comms and, ways that you can be inspired to do things differently. So Enjoy.
Welcome to the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, talking common sense for church communications. Here's Hannah and Joe.
Today's guest is a talented communicator, but also someone who has really supported, both Joe and myself in the past. And I'm so excited. We're so pleased and honoured to have the wonderful Laura Treneer with us today. Laura has worked with many, many churches as well as other organisations, including her current role with Frank Analysis. She also spent time working as CEO and Innovation Director at CPO. She has great experience in all things digital, brand and strategy. And so, I'm just so excited, but we are both just so looking forward to finding out more today. But first, we do need to get the most important questions out of the way so that our listeners can really get to the heart of who Laura is. So I'm passing this immense responsibility over to Joe to ask
That's right.
those important questions.
And the big one first, Laura, what is your favourite biscuit?
Ooh, I'd have to say the Garibaldi biscuit, or the squash fly biscuit, as we like to call it.
I was going to say, I needed talking through that, but I've got good memories of that. I mean, stuck in your teeth, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that the ones with the little, raisins in them?
But they're squished in the middle.
Oh.
That's come out of left field, but it's a good shout.
Yeah.
Why not?
So, moving things slightly more towards the church communications focus of this podcast, what is your favourite social media platform?
Well, you see, I would always have said Twitter, but I am slightly going off it. I think everyone is, because it has changed a lot in the last year.
Yeah.
LinkedIn is super useful for getting in touch with people and with people I haven't seen for ages. But yeah, I would probably still, on balance, say Twitter.
That's fair. Yeah, I think we can relate to that.
Yeah.
What about any favourite podcasts? Are there any that you tune into regularly?
Shockingly, no. I don't know when I would listen to a podcast. That's the problem. I recommend podcasts to loads of people. I've recommended Sacred Podcast and The Rest is History and, all the news ones, Americast and all that. But I don't actually have as much time as I'd like to listen to podcasts. So, and I have no excuse because I live by the sea. So I should just go for a walk along the sea and listen to podcasts. But I tend to just use it as time to think instead.
Yeah,
there is something lovely about listening to the waves and just that, it's very meditative.
Well, and I've realised I have my best ideas when I'm just walking really, really fast along the seafront. That's when all of the good thoughts that have been buried under all the urgent stuff, they kind of float to the surface. So you have to allow time for that. It's purposeful daydreaming.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, I like that.
So going from quite a profound thought there to maybe not so much, gourd or pomegranate is our last quickfire question.
See, I don't know where the gourd and pomegranate came from, but I'm going to say gourd because it makes me think of Ethiopia a little bit. And that's a country that's very close to my heart and I've spent quite a bit of time in. So there's a little association for me there somewhere.
Okay.
But yeah, afterwards you'll have to tell me what the story is there. Fairly random.
Yeah.
I think the gourd is winning for our guests. I think everyone said gourd so far for various different reasons.
I'm firmly in the pomegranate camp. I'm going to put it out there.
But yeah, I mean, depends on. I don't really want a gourd on my salad, but anyway. But now going on to a bit more, actually, it's interesting that you've already said that Ethiopia is important to you. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your journey into and sort of with church communications?
Yes. So I had the immense privilege of growing up in a very fun church community with my parents. I had a strong faith from when I was a teenager. I think it was tested fairly severely at various points, but that's probably how the roots grew deep, as is so often the way. I got into publishing first, actually. So I graduated from Cambridge. I did a lot of publishing there. I worked for some Christian charities. I did go to Ethiopia with an amazing mission organization before I got married, because I was marrying a guy who'd grown up in Kenya. He'd lived there till he was 18. That was his entire life. And I was totally clueless about that part of the world. So I thought I'll spend some time, not where he grew up, but country next door. And that was just immensely eye-opening. And I think that sense of the worldwide church, the amount we have to learn from the worldwide church. And also in Cambridge, I've been exposed to kind of really high church Anglicanism. So I'd grown up in a Baptist church. It was very informal. And this was singing evensong twice a week. And I was exposed to all this incredible liturgy, and my husband had grown up in churches in East Africa, and he's met people from all of these different traditions. And so this richness of Christianity grew immensely in my imagination and my understanding, and I realized how little I knew and how narrow my perspective was. And so then when I ended up working for different charities and some development charities, I worked for a couple of Christian mission organizations. My husband became pastor at our church, which is in central Brighton. It's very international. And I had this sense of all of these different ways that Christians communicated and charities communicated, was trying to join the dots in some of those things. And, you know, typically the church had a fairly old-fashioned perspective at that point on websites and newsletters.
Just at that point, not now. Right?
Well, I got involved as people do. You know, somebody said, "Would you be up for helping?" And then I ended up finding lots of other people who are interested in it. And so I helped build a team for communications at my church. And at some point during that journey, CPOs we're in Brighton, down the road in Worthing, CPO, Christian communications charity, been around for 60 years. They wanted to listen to church leaders, and I thought, brilliant, you know, that listening to their key stakeholders. And they asked my husband if he'd like to go to a focus group, and he said, you don't want me, you want my wife, because she's got so many opinions on this. So I went along, and just the potential was completely overwhelming. Here was this organization who had direct contact with thousands of churches, some of whom really were doing things exactly the same as they did in the 1950s. So I ended up getting involved and setting up this innovation hub in Brighton, and we got these designers around, and we tried to find lots of different styles and really stretch churches in their imagination of what was possible. You know, it doesn't have to be a poster that you bought 30 years ago that you stick up religiously every Easter. You know, actually what's relevant to the people around you, what's going to catch their attention, what's going to be engaging, what's going to be compelling, what's going to raise a discussion. And so we started asking these questions, and this was at a point where probably most churches did not have a website, and if they did, it was designed by a guy who said he'd done a course in HTML somewhere, you know, and it was
firmly designed in Microsoft front page.
There were some pretty bad things out there, but the motivation was good, you know. So we started doing some training, and then because, you know, helping with various national campaigns as well. So it was just an enormous privilege, really. And I wrote some books on church communications, and then in 2020, cunningly, just before lockdown, I didn't know. I thought, well, I realized that I'd done what I'd come to do at CPO, and it was time to let others have a crack at it and take it to the next place. So I after about a year and a half of praying about it, handed in my notice and set up Frank Analysis. And we help Christian organisations primarily, but also education institutions and organisations with their communications strategy.
Okay. So, I mean, we'll come back to your previous work directly with churches in a second, but can you talk us through a little bit more of what you do with Frank Analysis? Like, what does that look like, looking at these organisations and their strategy?
Well, it's taken all kinds of different forms, but if we take an example of, let's say, a relatively small Christian charity might think, well, we need a new website and we know it's going to cost a load of money and we need to raise some money and we don't really know how to go about that. There's a conversation there around, okay, so you need to do that and there's any number of ways of doing that. But before that, actually, what are you trying to say and who are you trying to speak to and what is it that they need? What is it that they want from you? And I sometimes use this image of a loop. So you've got you and you've got what you want to say. And all of the context around you. And you've got them and what they want and all of the context around them. And in order to communicate with them, there needs to be some kind of hook. There needs to be something about you that catches their attention. And sometimes we think that if we've got a fantastic product, fantastic resource, fantastic offering, that's going to be enough, that people are going to care. And of course they don't care. They've got busy lives, right? So there's got to be some kind of hook. But then for them to do anything about it, there's got to be something that then closes that loop, that is a trigger to help them connect with you. And so you ask these questions then about, what are the hooks? What are the triggers? Who are they? Who are you? What are your motivations? What are their barriers? How do they actually perceive you? And there's all kinds of tools to do that. But hopefully what you end up with is a way of communicating which is really focused, really measurable, really in line with the capacity, the amount of time and money and energy and skill you've got in your team, and is sustainable as well, so is able to move forward. So these are the big things, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's just about a conversation. Communication ultimately is not broadcast. It's about a conversation. It's about actually having a two-way exchange. I had a role briefly as chief listening officer, and a lot of the work that I do is listening. A lot of the work that I do is helping people articulate what they think, and then using all of those insights into something that then can be turned into a new form of communication. If we're not listening, then we're not communicating.
So yes, there's two levels of communication, obviously with the organizations that you're working for and how they're communicating, but also considering your communication with them. You're listening to them and speaking to them, and that sort of two-way street to get to the point where they want their strategy to be.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people know where they want to get to. They don't know how to get there, but also they don't have time in their day to have that conversation. We don't sit down and have those big questions given to us in a way where we have time to think through what we actually want to get, think through what we think.
To take a sort of cliche phrase from the business world, just too much time working in the business and not on the business, not taking that time to sort of reflect on what you're doing because you're too busy doing it. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a little bit where when you bring in somebody from the outside, that forces that conversation. Yeah.
And also when you're in it, you can't see the wood for the trees. You're too busy. You can't. It's been such a long time. And I know this from when I was leading CPO, that there was an enormous benefit in having a fresh perspective. I loved it when somebody new started on the team. I would just mine them for all of their first impressions in the first 2 weeks, because what they saw at that point, you couldn't generate. They're not institutionalized. They're not seeing everything through the perspective of all of the baggage and the relationships and everything else. It's just completely fresh. And that was so valuable.
I think we should do that in church as well, with sort of new attendees, new members, obviously not to scare them off, but to get their honest feedback at that early stage.
Yeah, and this really relates to church communications. So at our church, when people become members, we have a conversation with them. And one of the questions is, tell me how you first started coming along. And I've been to a few of these, and what I'm astounded by is the number of people who will say, well, it was amazing because I came along, and as I was leaving, This guy on the door said hello to me, asked me my name, asked me about myself. And then when I came back the next week, he remembered my name. There were loads of people in that room. You know, I can't believe he even noticed me. And let alone he actually remembered my name. And that blew me away. And that is the most powerful form of communication, you know, because it's seeing somebody and remembering somebody. It's about relationship. And I mean, I know that my husband takes that really seriously as a responsibility. So if honestly, sometimes if there's somebody new and he hasn't had a chance to say hello to them, he will run along the road. And if they don't want to talk, like he picks up on it, you know, he's not going to be that guy.
Yeah.
But he does want them to know that he's seen them and he's noticed them, and then he will come back and he will write down the names and he'll really try hard to remember them, and he'll do all of the things that you can do to remember somebody's name, because it's honoring them as people, you know. And if they do come back and they are remembered, that's such a powerful picture of, you know, this is a place where you can, you know, we're seen, you know. Church should be a place where we encounter God, where we have a sense of God knowing us and knowing what we need and meeting us, whether or not we want to talk to anyone, you know. And there's loads of people who come to church and actually don't want to be welcome, don't want to talk to anyone. That's fine. But just that act of noticing people and remembering them is a picture of God noticing us and remembering us.
Kind of just picking up of what you said a minute ago about asking new team members first impressions and stuff. How is it appropriate, or can we say as church leadership ask people for feedback of their impressions without it being like, hi, thanks for coming here, please fill out this survey? Like, because as lovely as it is to have the good stuff of well, you've been to church several times and now you're exploring becoming a member, is it helpful to sometimes have the less good things, like at least be aware of those less good things that
it's incredibly useful. It's incredibly useful, but I have no idea how you get it in a measurable way. I mean, I've had all kinds of friends visit our church over the years, and I've now learned that if I say to them, how did you find it, particularly if they've never been to church before, they won't give me a straight answer. Of course they won't. You know, I'm not the person to ask that question. You know, they'll understandably, you know, I remember one friend, and it was actually a really helpfully honest answer. She said, from a sociological perspective, it was very intriguing.
I can see that.
I know. And yeah, and I you know, I think it's, I've really wrestled with what's the right question to ask to find out what people honestly think. Yeah. But then I question whether that's actually the right question. You know, is it about what they think about church, or is it, did you get any sense of God speaking to you through something that happened here this morning? That's the more important question. You know, if they, you know, you really want people to have a positive experience and to feel a sense of warmth and welcome and some kind of encounter with God that they haven't had before. But actually, if that's been the case, it might be that they need a while to process that, but it's too personal for them to share. So,
but also I think I've spoken to myself about kind of thing in visiting lots of different churches over the years for work things, and I go into church very often with a work hat on, of like thinking about that kind of, oh well, what are the first impressions of, oh well, how does that link with online, on site, or how does that link with non-Christians or first-time churchgoers coming? And after a while I realized what my preference was, but I was like, okay, granted we shouldn't have no one on the doors, but maybe for some people not, that is fine, because it allows me to kind of like slowly ease into the church experience. But at the same time, there has been one church I went to and it was really nice, but also I was like, oh, they literally bounded down the steps outside into the street where I was sort of clearly slowly coming up to stop and walk in. And they were
was
like,
it Laura's
what?
husband by any chance?
but they were like, welcome. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm scared by this enthusiasm. And I am a very extrovert person. But I realised that actually for some people that's really lovely and welcoming. And for some people the kind of slower approach is better. So actually where I might have given my preference of feedback, that's not going to be the same for everyone. And you're not going to have kind of the perfect formula. For
Yeah,
people's
and
first
that's a
impressions.
really important point, isn't it, generally about church communications, that there's no formula. You've got to, so like in that, if they'd read your body language at that moment and thought, do you know what, I think she just wants to do her thing. That's fine, we'll leave her be. That might have felt like a more comfortable experience. But also with church communications generally, it's not like you can say, right, here is a template newsletter, or parish news sheet or poster or website or content calendar for Facebook, which is going to be perfect for every church. It doesn't exist, and it shouldn't, because we have to be contextual. We have to know who we're talking to, and it has to be bespoke, not just to the community that you're in, but the community that you are. So you have to know who is able to deliver what your great plan is.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about being influenced by the big church, city church websites, and how that can be really helpful. But at the same time, you need to be authentic to who you are. So it might be that you take things from that. But if you try and copy it, for a start, it probably won't look as good, because the chances are you don't have the skills or the budget that their designers do. But it won't be who you are. And so if by some miracle it does persuade people to come through the doors that wouldn't have otherwise, and then they see that it's completely not like you at all,
well,
they're
then
going to be,
it lacks integrity. That's what
exactly.
they see. So people increasingly are looking for integrity in churches. They're looking for churches who are transparent about who they are. And that can be in the subtlest of ways that we look for those things. We pick up the visual cues. I used to talk about if you had a church notice board that was completely crumbling and neglected and falling to bits, then what does that say about how the church looks after its people? If you have a church that really trumpets its eco credentials, but that hasn't reflected that in the way that they use their land, that communicates a mismatch. I looked at some websites from a lot of churches in London recently for a piece of work I was doing, and realized that the language that they used around themselves could pretty much be divided into kind of 9 groups. So there were those who would talk about being sacred and beautiful, perhaps, or liturgical, and they might have pictures of people in their vestments, and they might have a picture of a mass. They might have a picture of what would be happening on a normal Sunday morning, and then you'd have others with videos and photos of people with hands in their hair, and they would describe themselves as lively and vibrant and all of these words which we use on websites.
We should have church website bingo as like a special episode or something.
Yeah, but the thing is that the language that they'd chosen their words really carefully. So some of them would talk about being family churches, and some of them would talk about being gospel-centered churches, and some of them would talk about being historic churches. And those words are really, really helpful because they signify a culture. If you imagine a mountain under the sea, the website is the very top bit that's poking above the sea, but most of the mountain might be underneath the sea, and all of those values are underneath. So it's a culture, organizational culture triangle that I talk about sometimes, but it's understanding the difference between the artifacts, the things that we show, which are at the top, which might be the pictures that we choose to put on the homepage of a website, but right at the very bottom of the deep underlying values, which might be embedded in generations of history within the church and community. You can't attempt to explain that, but those who've been there will know that, and that comes out in how we communicate. So it's understanding who we are below the surface, as well as just the pictures that we use or the words that we use.
But I think linking it back to what you were saying before about that loop and that sort of two-way communication and what are people actually getting, despite what we're trying to say. You mentioned a few phrases there that signify something like gospel-centered, for example. Now, that definitely does signify something, but it probably signifies differently to someone like us who spend a lot of time looking at websites and communication, to your average Christian who's been in church all their life, to someone who's never been to church or very rarely goes to church. And so it's looking at it through that lens of the different people and not assuming that just because we understand what that means that they will.
Absolutely. And it's recognizing as well that, as I was saying before, that people see your context as well as see you. So if you use a phrase like, well, there's many examples, but if you use a phrase which has enough Christian depth and hinterland around it, then other Christians will spot that and they'll know what that means. And it will either be something that puts you in a corner, or it will be something that draws people. But you need to do that intentionally and with your eyes open. For people outside the church, absolutely, we try not to use the jargon, but there are we need to recognize that sometimes they will see things, they will see values which are not from us, they're from other churches like us. And there's very little we can do about that often. They might have had a bad experience, and when they see us, they see that bad experience. And that's the really tough reality that we face. And that's not something that you can overcome with the stuff that we put out publicly always. And having that invitation for face-to-face contact and relationship and connection, and there are loads of ways of doing this with online as well, is so important. But is realizing that people will have perceptions about us as a church, and part of the role of communications is to shape those perceptions in a way that reflects truth rather than what they might have heard, which might not be true.
That's brilliant. This is all really helpful.
Writing so many notes.
The thing is, they're big issues. It's hard enough these days to get someone to pay attention, let alone do something about it. So do you know the AIDA tool? So awareness, interest, desire, action. It's a marketing, one of the millions of little acronyms that are used. But with churches, it's easy to assume that people are aware that we're there and know that we exist. They might be aware that the building's there, but unless the building says something about what's going on inside, then they won't know anything else. So joining a Facebook group, for example, a local Facebook group as a church, is a way of raising awareness. You're not trying to do anything really more than say, hi, we're here. Yeah, we're people. We do stuff. We care. Interest is a whole other level. That's people actually paying attention. It's clicking on the link. It's engaging. It's opening the magazine or whatever. The desire is about those triggers that I talked about before. Actually, what is it that people are going to do about this? And it might be that they sign up for an email update, and it's just like signing up for an email update from a shop. As far as it's an organization, they're being put on a mailing list. That's the only thing that's being asked of them. That's all they're signing up for. But at least it's an expression of interest. But then taking action is a long way from that first bit. The taking action might be turning up to a carol concert, or it might be, donating to a community appeal, or donating to a food bank, or whatever it is. But that's a long way from the beginning. And so it's realizing that all the different tools that we have play their own roles, but they're not all trying to do everything. You can't,
And that first action may still be really far away from someone coming to faith or some joining regularly, and
Absolutely. It's they're long journeys, but and every bit plays its part. But sometimes we can have such high expectations of our communications. We can be so ambitious for what they're going to achieve, because we're expecting them to do everything. And if they were trying to do everything, they'd be bad at all of it. And actually, if you just keep it really, really simple and say, well, the purpose of this is to do this one job for this one group in this one way. That's all we're expecting of it, but it plays its part in the whole picture. Then we're less likely to get discouraged.
So thinking back to what you were saying about the current clients that you work with and tend to be sort of bigger organizations, and how you start to approach a strategy with them. Churches, as we often say, tend to have much smaller budgets for this sort of thing. A team of people doing these things is a dream a lot of the time. But what can we apply? If a church is just getting started to think seriously about their comms, which granted, a lot more churches are a little bit further along that journey these days than when you mentioned before, which is brilliant. But if people are at that beginning stage, what can we apply to them in terms of strategy? Where do we get started?
Okay, well, one really good thing to do, which churches often don't get round to doing, is to take a cold, hard look at the people in your area and the people that you're trying to reach, and to access some data to do that. So
Okay.
the census in 2021 is now online with this incredible mapping tool. So you can go to the ONS website and there's these mapping tools, and you can literally, there's loads of different ways of doing it, but you can draw a map, or you can just click on an area of the map and you can find out everything you would want to know about that group of people. So you can find out how many people say they're Christian. You can find out what age they are. You can find out whether they walk to work. You can find out what kind of house they live in, what their household income is. You know, so you can get a really clear sense of who it is that is actually in the remit of your church, is in the area of your church. And it might be that you have, I mean, our church, for example, is right in the centre of Brighton. Where we are is apparently one of the most godless bits of the UK. That was the headline, you know. So about 60% of people say they have no religion. So that's a very proactive, I do not like religion kind of statement on a census. But a lot of the families in the church come from a bit further out of town, where that is a completely different statistic. So there, and there's a lot more families. So where we are is, where I live is very international. It's very transient. A lot of people in temporary housing, a lot of people freelancing and doing 5 jobs, and you know, that's the reality. So, but a lot of the families in church moved out to where they could get a garden and, you know, a nice school and a bit more space. So you've got 2 completely different communities that you're talking to. So what you put out might be slightly different for those different groups, but you've got them in your mind when you're communicating. You're not assuming, for example, that everyone who's there on a Sunday has completely brilliant English and is university educated. So actually, if you get somebody up to do a reading who doesn't have brilliant English and is not born in this country, then that communicates loads, and that communicates to the people who you have locally. Similarly, when we're putting out our Christmas flyers, right? I know from the stats that the vast majority of people who will get one of those through their door would not dream of going to a church, not in a million years. But what we do is, on the back of the flyer, we say, could this be a year when you think more about your spirituality? And then we put in some links to, like, try praying, which is a really great resource for people who are kind of pre-alpha, you know, just might consider praying in some way. We put in a link to a Bible website for people who want to study and learn and know more about the Bible. We did put in a link to Alpha, and, you know, having a link to courses like that is really good. And then we put in a kind of a prayer that was a kind of prayer for our community. And we put in some stuff about the debt centre, and we put some stuff about the food bank, things like that, which connect to people's, again, it's an awareness thing. So even then, but it might turn the awareness into interest. You know, that might be that they, you know, they're never going to come to a carol service, but they might click on one of those links. So what I'd say to a church is, first look at who's around you and think, what do they want from you? What do they want from the church? How can we communicate something that's actually relevant to them? And it might be as simple as that. Instead of just saying, come to services, you know, this is the way that you could discover more about God from the comfort of your own home. These are some websites you could go to, something like that.
There's so much in there. I mean, even the fact that we're starting from that place of looking at who's around you and not just assuming that we're already aware of that demographic, because
it's changing.
You know, it changes all the time. You know, not going straight to thinking about what should our website look like, what tools should we be using for social media or anything like that, but looking at the people. And I think the other thing that really stuck out to me there as well is about the resources on the back of your flyer, that it's not just all about your own church. It's not about getting them to your website, but you're pointing to other things and different steps, different routes that they may take. Because, to put it bluntly, it's not about getting them through your door. It's about, with God's help, getting them one step closer to his kingdom.
Yeah. And I mean, can you imagine a world where churches were pointing to other churches as well? You know, but there's a bigger conversation, isn't there? You know, like you could put on the back of that flyer, here are 10 reasons people go to church, or here are some quotes from people in our church about their spiritual journey. You know, you could, it's on a Facebook page, instead of having talking about what you've got coming up. It's telling stories of the people there. It's having little 20-second interviews with people who have had some kind of experience, and it doesn't have to be the lifelong dramatic story. It can be the something that happened this week story.
Yeah.
It's ways of connecting with people where it gives them something to think about, talk about, and say, oh, I saw this thing on, I saw this thing pop up on my feed the other day, and it wasn't what I expected,
Exactly. And they're the little hooks that you mentioned. And I think, they're things which will engage with people, but also looking at it from the other point of view where we're often coming from a stage of, right, what do I post this week? I'm really struggling for content. I'm trying to put stuff together for the month ahead. I have no idea. Not only these stories that people want to hear, but they're ready-made stories. You don't have to go away and write them. Okay, there's a bit of production and organization involved, but people have these stories in your church. So to go and film them briefly and tell these stories is a no-brainer.
Yeah, absolutely. And also there's loads of great content out there from loads of other organizations. It doesn't always have to be homegrown. Signpost to other stuff. Again, if it's not about getting people through the doors, as you put it, it's about pointing people to what God's doing, then there's loads of ways of doing that. Churches who don't have any youth group can point to stuff that's happening in other churches where they've got stuff going on for youth. We can celebrate what others are doing. It's such a powerful thing when churches celebrate what other churches are doing. When they demonstrate prayer for other churches, giving to other churches, partnership with other churches. That's so powerful, because what you're doing is combating that narrative of, oh, the church is all divided, they all really hate each other, Anglican Twitter's so mean. Actually, let's tell a different story of in this community, we think they're great. They're not perfect. We're not perfect. They know we're not perfect. We know they're not perfect. But ultimately, we're working on the same team towards the same goal, and we want to cheer each other on. We want to support each other. It's not it's not being naive about the profound differences that are there, but it's being hopeful about the bigger story that's there and pointing to that instead.
It's almost like someone wise once said that people would know we were God's disciples by our love for one another, and as if that doesn't just apply within our own church meetings. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's huge opportunity to do that, particularly in communities where everyone does kind of know everyone. And I'm an urbanite, so I don't feel massively knowledgeable about rural communities, but I learned so much from working with the Earth Rank Centre in Germinate and some other church planting networks. And there's loads happening with the Caleb stream from HCB, and there's a lot more happening in rural churches. But in a lot of communities where we're able to find ways to celebrate each other, it's not a threat, it's a strengthening thing. And it's where we can tell stories. What we're telling stories of is what God's doing in our local community through other people as well as ourselves. And also out of that partnership, you get it reciprocates, it grows, it becomes something that can abound in all kinds of ways. You never know what God's going to do with that, but I know from my own experience that where we are generous and where we are able to find ways to work together, even when the world says we should be competing, when we find ways of doing that, God blesses it, and He just does. Things take root that you never could have planned. And I've been so thankful for that so many times when, even when I was at CPO, and there were times when it did feel like it ought to be a competition or even a commercial competition in some way, and you just think, no, I don't want to do it like that. And I remember there was one guy, and we had a conversation, and he was like, I didn't think you'd talk to me because we're basically competing for the same stuff. And I was like, no, I think absolutely, but I think you're great, and he was like, and then we found ways of working together through that, which, it was all God's doing. It didn't make sense, but as Christians, we shouldn't be as it is with the world. We should be different. We should find ways of doing what Jesus said. Really.
Okay, so I kind of feel like some of the bits you've said would go into this, but what do you think are the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities for churches in the UK right now when thinking about communication? So already there's been a couple of things you've said that I think could go into both of them, but what would you say if we're looking at the landscape now?
I think one of the very practical realities is the lack of volunteers. So there was an article in the Guardian a couple of days ago about this from some of the broader charity landscape, and I'm hearing it from charities in all kinds of different fields. And EA have done their post-COVID research, Changing Church, on this and they've seen the same. It's partly to do with the frequency. So people who used to go to church once a week are now going every couple of weeks, and people who went every couple of weeks are going every couple of months. People are finding it harder to commit to things regularly, and actually just that sense of regularity, that sense of being pinned down to a commitment, it's just been stripped out. It's gone. This has a huge impact on children and youth work in particular. So I think that is an enormous challenge for churches, because we have to find new ways of creating community among volunteers, so it doesn't feel like an obligation, it feels like family. There was a reliance on an intrinsic sense of duty before, and it's really good that that's gone in a way, because it was never enough. Duty will only take you so far, and also different generations will approach that in very different ways. Kids who've grown up with, so we have a family diary in our house. I have 3 teenage children, and I really like the idea that we all know where everyone is at the whole time. But one of them, she's like, well, I never know where I'm going to be, because we only make plans 10 minutes before. Like, it's not like I say, yes, I'm going to see my friends next Wednesday at 7. It doesn't work like that, So that generation, they just like that concept. So it just is not there. Right. So what will what will help us with our teams for communications and for volunteering in all kinds of areas will be that sense of working together, being part of something together, being part of something bigger, having friends, having fun together. Now, communications can be a really isolated task in a church. You're the guy who's like 2 a.m. correcting the website because you didn't have time during the working day. How can we make it fun? How can we have ideas together? How can we create a culture where this is the really great bit of church life, because you get to try things out and you're not tied in?
I think that's something we talked about in our Christmas episode, actually, of saying, if you have a meeting straight after Christmas to review all of your comms and get that much ahead for next year, make it a nice thing. Go to a coffee shop, meet up in a group, and make it a social, creative activity rather than a boring admin one.
Yeah, and comms needs admin people and creative people. Like you need both, and they need to work together really well. But sometimes the admin wins, and so if you can make it creative enough so that part of the fun is that you get to try things, and it doesn't matter if they go really badly, you're just experimenting, and it can fail, and that's fine. Yeah. And on social media that can work really well. Also having not signing people up for a life sentence, so saying we're going to do this for 3 months, and then the default is that everyone finished, or a year. A year works a lot better with children and youth, but like we'll do it for a year, and at the end the expectation is that everyone will stop, but we're hoping you might want to continue, but we're not going to have any fixed, that it's up to you. So people will then say, and I heard about a church that did this, they said every volunteer in every ministry in August finishes. That's the end of what they're doing, unless they want to carry on. And what that meant is that people, when they sign up in August for the year ahead, they're like, I will go for it for this year. And they've enjoyed it so much that at the end of the year, they decide to carry on, and they decide to carry on. You actually don't lose anyone, but everyone feels free, that they know that it's their choice,
And I suppose it also, from the other side, gives an inbuilt sort of permission to have that review chat with someone, that if you think actually it's not working out for them, it's not an awkward, right, now we've got to bring this up out of the blue, but there's that natural time to do it.
Yeah. And we're not very good at evaluation with volunteers. And we're not very good at evaluation for communications, because it's like super awkward to say somebody, it's not great. But yeah, that does create a way of doing it. And the other way that creates a way of doing it is just having a culture where you do try things and you try different things and you say, well, we've done this for a while, now we're going to try something else. That also makes it easier to have that conversation. But a communications team can be a great team, and it doesn't have to be all people within the church as well. It can be really great to get someone from the local community who's even not part of the church, because they will give you that outsider's perspective, and they might have more time. Gosh, there was a brilliant woman who was in the toddler group at our church. There was no in a million years she was ever going to come on a Sunday. She made that very clear. But she really wanted some graphic design experience and said to me, could I volunteer at the church just as a volunteer to do some graphic design? And it was brilliant, because she produced this incredible stuff completely for free to build up her portfolio. But also she was designing for herself. So it was perfect. It was, and we got to know her really well, and she felt really comfortable with everyone. And yeah, that was a great scenario.
But she probably left, or however it finished, or whatever, going, oh, they're normal people. Actually, do you know what? They gave me a really wonderful opportunity to, as you say, build my portfolio. And like, I bet she'd have left an experience with a church in a far more positive light, because of actually just getting to know you guys as individuals and as people and as an organization, rather than, oh, it's the church, that big scary building at the end of the road, and we don't know what
that's
they do.
so true. And to be honest, one of the reasons I got to know her was because I was helping at the toddler group, and she was waiting to come in, and I heard her saying to her friends, oh, these crazy Baptists, they're so good. And I was like, right, I take that as a challenge. So I decided to become her friend, and we just got on really well, which is why then she felt free to ask for volunteering, whether there was any options to do volunteering. But that's a little bit of it, isn't it? It's that was her perception, and there's no way that the church could have changed that. It's only meeting people that changes that. I mean, who knows? She probably thought we were even crazier after.
I was going to say maybe it confirmed her suspicion, but then again, it's permission to be weird, right?
Yeah, sure. That's the take home.
I really like how you've taken something that's a challenge and put loads of ways of creating that into a position of opportunity. But is there anything sort of maybe on a technical level that are opportunities for us as church communicators?
Yeah, there's so much, isn't there? I think one thing I'd say, and I'm not going to talk lots about it because but it is something worth exploring, is the whole intergenerational character of churches, which I think is something that can be massively explored and used in our communications. And it's such a defining hallmark of churches that you do not see anywhere else, and there's such enormous power in it. And having worked with organizations who focus on the very old and also the very young, churches in local communities are able to demonstrate something of God's kingdom in terms of every age and every tribe and every nation, all of those things. And there's just something to explore there. Maybe it's a question for churches to ask: how do we encourage intergenerational ministry and reflect that in our communications and use it in our communications? The other thing I would just say, we talked before about that balance of admin and creative in communications work for churches. There are some really great tools out there, and you've talked about a lot of them on this podcast, which is brilliant. But I think the other opportunity is to be mavens, like look for the new stuff that's out there in terms of tools and see how you could use it. We're at this time in technology where things are just changing so fast. And, ChatGPT the other day wrote a Bible study for my daughter, who had to lead a Christian Union session on a particular passage, and she didn't have time to do it. So she got it to write 5 questions for her. It's drawing off the wealth of, knowledge of loads of people over loads of time, and it did it for her in 5 seconds, and that was super useful. And she can adapt it and change it and check it as much as she likes, but that's just one example. There are so many tools out there. There are so many great apps. There's Christian websites. There's resources out there. Just be curious. We need to be curious and look around and see what's there and share it. Just because it's not homegrown doesn't mean that we can't share it. Just because it might have some slightly problematic connection or connotation somewhere doesn't mean that you throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can caveat this stuff. You can say, this might not be for everyone, but some people might find this really useful. You can signpost, you can find ways of using what's out there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. We're really good at doing that as churches and as Christians, because we kind of get stuck in our bubble. We don't have to do that. Let's keep being on the lookout for stuff that we might be able to use.
Yeah. I think that's a really positive but profound thing to end on. That we're not just being selfish with it, but seeking to achieve the same goal. I know you don't like to sort of do the whole self-promotion thing too much, but I mean, you mentioned the books that you've written. Are they still available? Can you tell us a bit about them?
Yes, I believe so. They were published in 2017 by BRF, Bible Reading Fellowship, another great organisation, and they're called Reach Out, and you can probably get them on Amazon for a matter of pennies, I should think, by now. So, they're there, and it's Frank Analysis is the name of my company. I mean, there's so much good stuff out there. There's some really good books on church communications. Mark Crosby's book, SPCK, I can't remember what it's called now. It's bright yellow. It's very pretty.
So Can Everyone Hear?
So Can Everyone Hear? Yeah, that's right. That's a good one. There's the Church Comms Collective.
Yeah,
that's an excellent resource. Yeah. There's some really good stuff out there. And there's a Christian Creative Directory as well, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. We'll link all of those things in the episode description.
Yeah, and I'm going to send you the link for the ONS mapping tool because I'm a bit of a data nerd, and it's just really interesting.
Laura, thank you so much for coming on today. As I say, you don't like self-promotion, but I think we are so glad that you've agreed to spend this time with us, and I think everyone who listens will benefit from that. So I'm sure we could go on all day, but let's. I know.
Thank you for giving me an excuse to infuse.
Thanks, Laura.